I'm Carmine Gallo with Bill Carr, co-author of the book Working Backwards: Inside Stories and Secrets from Inside Amazon. Bill, you joined Amazon in 1999, spent 15 years working closely with Jeff Bezos. Bezos is rightfully celebrated as one of the greatest entrepreneurs in the world today. He's also an extraordinary communicator. How would you describe Jeff Bezos and his communication skills? And secondly, do you think that those skills played a role in Amazon's success and growth?
Yeah, Jeff was an exceptional communicator. Even though I spent 15 years with the company, I was amazed by the way that in various meetings, day-to-day meetings, or larger all-company meetings, all-hands meetings, it seemed as if I could learn something new from Jeff each week, each day, each year, and and he had an amazing way of using analogies to help paint vivid pictures for me and for other members of the company to really understand complex topics and be able to then remember those topics and focus on them over long periods of time. The other way in which he was an amazing communicator and teacher is that when you're in a business meeting with a CEO and they give some sort of pronouncement about, here's what I think, here's what I think we should do. Many would just leave it at that and then expect you to go do it. Jeff would always go beyond that, which is he would say, after reviewing this information, here's my take on what we should do, and then he would go backwards and describe, here's how I got there. I looked at it through this lens or through this filter, and in doing so, I arrived at this conclusion. So not only would he describe sort of what he thought the insight was, but he would describe sort of the thought process that he went through to get there, and he would coach and teach people on that, which was that it was his way of helping people understand his insights, but also coaching and teaching people to have a similar thought process and be able to arrive at similar insights.
Jeff was also instrumental at communicating very clearly and consistently the culture within Amazon. From day one, to use one of Jeff's most famous metaphors, he clearly communicated these four pillars of company culture. Before we jump into each one, I'd like you to explain them. You write in Working Backwards that it is critical for leaders to articulate the core elements of a company's culture early and often. And here's what you say: do not assume that simply stating them and displaying them will have any significant effect. It has to start from the top, and it has to be communicated consistently. Did Bezos remind you and the other senior leaders of these pillars or these guiding principles each and every day?
Almost invariably. So almost invariably when, if you're wrestling with any complicated issue, your perspective on the issue guides your outcome. And so Jeff would remind us of to have the perspective of focus on the customer, not the competitor, or we need to think much longer term about the solution. So it's typical for people to actually come up with solutions that deal with some result that might land this quarter, this month, right away. But Jeff thought in a much larger time scale, thought in terms of years, decades, and that you'll arrive at a very different conclusion if you think about it on that time scale. Furthermore, he was constantly provoking us to be inventive and take risks. They had to be well calculated risks. But a lot of companies don't actually encourage people to do this because if you take a lot of risks, you're going to fail some percentage of the time, and most people don't like the feeling of failing. And in many cases, companies consider that to be a career ender. So yes, these topics would come up continuously in meetings and discussion.
I love it. All of his analogies and his stories and his explanations would reinforce the four pillars. So you've already started mentioning them. Why don't we go through them very carefully? Because I think they have valuable lessons, not only for people who work at a large company like Amazon, but for startups and entrepreneurs and every business owner. Let's talk about each and every pillar and why it matters. Number one, customer obsession.
Yeah, and this is a second part to it. Is that Amazon is customer obsessed rather than being competitor obsessed. So a lot of companies talk about focusing on the customer, being customer obsessed, being customer centric, but it's easy to say it, but it's actually quite hard to do it. And the reason it's hard to do it is that as you go through your day-to-day life as a leader and a manager, um, the people, here are the different things that are in your ear. The people you work with, who are focused on a lot of times their own internal needs and wants, and their own internal skills and capabilities. You'll hear, you'll see what your competitors do. They'll launch new products. They'll make announcements in the press, and so it's very easy to focus on like, what are my competitors doing, because that information is readily available. And it often appears that that's the best way to get ahead. Um, and in many companies' cases, if you have business partners, you're hearing what your business partners have to say, which was a big part of my job. I interface daily with motion picture studios, record companies, flat panel manufacturers, and they would express very clearly to me in top-to-top meetings what their needs were. But how am I supposed to get the perspective, though, of the millions or tens of millions of customers who are actually using my product? I don't have any meetings with them. They don't write articles in the press. They're not launching new products. So, in fact, it's actually quite difficult to. They're never represented at the meeting. So you have to actually come up with very specific mechanisms and processes to ensure that you are, in fact, listening to and understanding what the customer needs and factoring their needs into every decision you make. That is not easy to do.
The second principle that defines Amazon, long-term thinking.
Yeah, so and long-term thinking, longer term than most companies. And look, most companies are subject to hitting quarterly goals. Wall Street is monitoring their every move, or their investors, if they're not public, are monitoring their every move and are anxiously awaiting what are the financial results for this quarter, and this year. And in many companies, by the way, the executives their compensation is tied to quarterly or annual results. And the problem is that if all of your orientation is around a 3 to 12 month horizon, there are not a lot of very large sustainable businesses that you can go create and build in that time window that you will actually realize economic value, free cash flow, and profit in that time window. And so you need to have a much longer time horizon that you actually think about developing new products, services, and businesses for customers if you want to realize that. Products like one of the biggest product that I built and managed at Amazon is Amazon Prime Video, which today has more than 100 million customers around the world who are watching and streaming movies and TV shows, and it is a highly accretive product to the Prime subscription base, which is the primary driver of e-commerce sales for the company. Well, it took me and my team more than 7 years of work before we landed on the right formula that started to actually gain the right results. And even when we found that formula, it required several more years of investment in content. And so it was a decade plus investment for the company to actually start to realize, gains and profits from Prime Video. So you have to have a really, but now that business is a huge global business for the company that will yield dividends for theoretically for decades to come. So having that long time horizon is critical if you want to actually build something big and enduring.
The third principle, eagerness to invent. How do we get that across to entrepreneurs? I think that's natural. There's going to be an
Yes.
eagerness to invent, but how does that become a guiding principle from a leader to a team? Eagerness to invent. What does that mean?
Yeah, so eagerness to invent means that instead of having a culture of where you're focused on the safety of the status quo and of incremental gains off of an established business, an established process, an established base, that you actually, in order to make substantial leaps forward, whether that innovation is an operations or productivity innovation, or that innovation is a whole new product and business, you're going to actually have to take some real risk, because if you're going to create something new that could result in some sort of stepwise improvement, it means you're actually creating something that doesn't exist today. And anyone who's ever been in the business of creating something that doesn't exist today knows that if they think they know, that they can't know whether it's actually going to work or not, which means inherently there's risk, which means that sometimes it's actually not going to work and you're going to fail. Most companies actually create a culture of fear of failure, because failure can mean career limiting, limit your career upwards, or it can mean you're fired from the company. And so it's actually, you have to take proactive steps to create a culture where people don't have that fear to fail, and then, and in fact, realize that if they're not actually taking some risk and inventing, they're not doing their job.
The fourth and final principle, operational excellence.
Yeah. So a lot of companies, so there's sort of this yin and yang, right? You talk about there are people who are innovative, creative thinkers, and then the other end of the spectrum, there are leaders and companies who can make the trains run on time and are operationally excellent. One of the things that Amazon rejected was the idea that it's an either or proposition. We embrace the idea that it's an and, that you can do both. But doing both is really hard. So being operationally excellent means that also that you are, the customer, Amazon customers, they see a duck that is gliding across the water, or a swan that's gliding across the water. What they never see are the feet that are furiously working beneath the water to actually make sure that, in fact, when you order that item, it shows up at your house within 1 to 2 business days. And Amazon had a rigorous culture of being data-based, of having strict goals for, achieving, Six Sigma quality for many of its processes, for having rigorous process to audit defects within the company, using a rigorous process called, COE to, once a defect is identified, to root out those defects, fix them at the root cause level. Amazon is as operationally a rigorous company as any company in the world. And most people don't see that, but actually having that commitment and that pride to do so is something that customers are, no one is going to ever explicitly state that we need you to do that. You have to embrace that yourself.
Bill, I know that you know Amazon's new CEO, Andy Jassy, and you and I are talking just within 24 hours of the announcement that Andy is moving from AWS, the cloud computing division of Amazon, which he created, and is now going to become CEO, and while Jeff Bezos takes on another role of executive chair, so he has more time to spend on some of his other projects. Andy Jassy in particular, does he live these same principles?
Yeah, so Andy is what we call a true Amazonian. This is a term that people inside Amazon use. And that term is a term that means, does this person fundamentally live and breathe, the core cultural pillars, the leadership principles of the company, help develop and reinforce the processes? Are they both, that yin and yang? Are they equally strong as a product innovator and inventing on behalf of customers as they are taking professional pride and operational excellence? Andy is all those things. Andy, knows the company through and through. He started off, his career the first 5 years of his career is working on the e-commerce business. He's been a member of the Amazon S team, the senior leadership team, for well over a decade plus, and which means that he's been a part of deep and thorough business reviews of all parts of Amazon's business. So Andy already knows the business and knows the company very well. He's going to be an amazing leader for Amazon.
Well, Bill, thank you for an amazing book, Working Backwards. Bill Carr, co-author with Colin Breyer. Thank you, Bill, so much. It was a pleasure to talk to you.
It was a pleasure as well, Carmine. Thanks for having me on.